Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I am very happy to welcome you to this fall afternoon discussion of a great new book, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President, by my friend Edward F. O'Keefe. I've gotten to know Ed since he was introduced to me as the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Foundation, or Theodore Roosevelt Museum Foundation, which you're building in North Dakota. And then he told me he also was writing this book about a topic that I've always been fascinated by and appreciated. You know, we've all read Mornings on Horseback and the Edmund Morris biography, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, and we know a little bit about the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and the really remarkable women around him, his mother, his sisters, and his two wives, and his daughter.
Yes.
And so we're going to cover all of those. But before we get to that, a fascinating topic, I'd like to just ask you as an historian, given that this is well-trod ground, what is it in the documentation or what's new? What did you discover that you didn't know, or what documents did you find that you were able to draw on?
Well, Robert, thank you for having me here at AEI. It's a true pleasure to talk with you, and thank you all for coming out on this lovely fall afternoon. It's good to be with you. So what's new? As you said, Theodore Roosevelt is well-trod ground, but history tends to reveal itself when it's ready. In the book, there are 11 new letters, never before previously reported or discovered. Harvard called those letters the single greatest discovery since TR's death in 1919. Several of the letters actually cover a period that we don't know much about in TR's life, the time when he was in the Dakota Badlands after the deaths of his wife and mother on the same day in the same house. 1885, he fills his diary with what he went hunting and what he did during the day, but he doesn't reveal a lot of his emotional well-being at that point, and some of these letters speak to that. There are also 24 letters that were donated by Alice Roosevelt Longworth, his daughter, who was born just 2 days before the death of his wife. Those were love letters between her mother, Alice, and Theodore Roosevelt. They were not available to Edmund Morris when he wrote The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. They were not available to David McCullough when he wrote his wonderful book, and Mornings on Horseback. And there were some pretty amazing discoveries within the archives of both Sagamore Hill and the Houghton Library. I'll just tell you about one. At Sagamore Hill, there was an entry that said Alice Lee Hare, and the curator said, well, that is the hair that her mother kept, as you would as a keepsake of the baby. And I said, you know what, I know it's going to seem odd, but a woman who died at 22 years old and we know very little about, I'd love to see it. Anything that we have in the historical record of this particular person who's largely been lost and obscured in history, I'd love to see it. And we got it out, and it was almost looked like a Tiffany box. It was a teal blue, and opened it up, and indeed on top were these little lockets of hair that said Alice Lee, 9 months old, Alice Lee, 8 years old. But there was something more underneath. And as we lifted the box, we discovered pictures of Alice Hathaway Lee, Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, and 16 inches of her hair with a card that said, in TR's unmistakable handwriting, "The hair of my sweet wife Alice, cut after death." So the lore written in Edmund Morris and McCullough is that, you know, he largely expunged Alice Lee from his memory. But here, for the first time in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, definitive proof, physical proof, in the form of this keepsake, the photos and the hair that TR kept and hid from his second wife, Edith, for the rest of his life.
Well, we're going to come back to Edith and the relationship between Alice and Edith a little bit. But those letters that we talked about, I just want to be careful, they are they were from him to others and to him from others. It's both
Exactly.
kinds.
Yes, exactly. So the 11 letters were actually locked in a safe at Sagamore Hill since 1954. And Greg Wynn, the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, finally had the ability to open that safe and shared those letters with me during the research phase of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. And they are both letters from Theodore Roosevelt and to him, primarily from his older sister, Bammy.
Okay.
And so you really get an insight into,
Yes.
you're getting a dialogue, what he's saying from Dakota to his sister and what his sister is saying back to him.
And not to bring the museum and library into it, but will these things reside at the library at some point? Are you going to get them for that collection?
That's the
too?
hope. That's the hope. So we're in the process of building the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in the Badlands of North Dakota, the pillar principles of citizenship, leadership, and conservation. I just spent last week with Dr. Hayden of the Library of Congress talking about some of their archives. Theodore Roosevelt's archives is spread to the wind, 70 different institutions across America, a lot of private collections. But there are some very significant objects that have never been seen by the American public. The diary that he wrote on February 14th, 1884, he puts an X, and the light has gone out of my life. That
February
diary,
14th, Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day,
Yeah,
exactly. I
tragic.
mean, he lost his wife and his mother on the same day, Valentine's Day, which was 4 years to the day that he had announced his engagement to Alice. Yeah. And that object is at the Library of Congress. It has never been publicly shown. It's not the Constitution.
They got a lot of things.
It'd be a wonderful addition to the collection.
To your collection, which
Such
is gonna
an
be great.
emotionally powerful object.
And we have these wonderful presidential libraries and museums. A lot of them started and by presidents that are more recent in time, and they were alive for the creation and building of them, some of them. But this is one that never got done, and you're doing it. And
well,
it's a great thing.
Thank you. I think living presidents or the family of presidents who have died in office and then take over the presidential library, they're telling the first rough draft of history from their perspective. The Obama Presidential Center will open in 2026, the same year that the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library will open. Well, we have 120 years of perspective.
Right, yeah.
We know what endures. We know what the president's legacy has been, and can, I think, with more authority, tell those stories without the interference of modern history.
It's going to be great. All right, now let's get to the women. So one of the things that we write about at AEI, our scholars, is about the evolving relationships between men and women and the different generations, and we have some concerns about what's happened in modern times in that regard. But Theodore Roosevelt had very healthy relationships with women, his sisters, his wives, and his mother. He was comfortable around women. They liked him. He liked them. So let's start with his mother, Mittie, Martha Bullock Roosevelt. In the previous books that we've discussed, there's a lot of emphasis about the great man, the father, who would carry Teddy Roosevelt around when he was suffering from asthma. And Teddy Roosevelt has a great line, he was the greatest man I ever knew. And then there's the great tragedy that the father didn't serve in Civil War, and that was always sort of a black mark that hung over Teddy Roosevelt. Mother is more quiet in the background, but you show her to be actually the bigger personality.
Mittie, you can only have to look as far as what your in-laws say about you.
Yeah.
So her brother-in-law said of Mittie and Theodore Roosevelt's parents, between Mittie's liveliness and your solemnity, you make an even pair. Yeah. In other words, opposites attract. Yeah. Thee was a great man. I mean, I think, his father, just for a moment, he's the co-founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He's the founder of the first orthopedic hospital in the country in New York. He's a founder of the orphanage for the newsboys. I mean, he's a wonderful man, engaged in all kinds of civic activities. Great old New York character. Well, funny you should mention that, because that was one of Theodore Roosevelt's neighbors, Edith Wharton, a lifelong pen pal of his. Speaking of his relationships with women, his father dies at age 20. Theodore Roosevelt is age 20. His father is 46. And whatever greatness his father had in his memory only went to a new and unadoring height, right? I mean, but his mother, Mittie, She's vivacious. She has these incredibly clever turns of phrase. She's the one that introduces him to the McGuffey Reader series that has the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. She's the one who says, you know, I've got an awkward child who's fond of taxidermy and you know, lives a life of the mind and his imagination in books.
And wears
he needs
spectacles.
friends, right? He needs friends. So she's the one that invites the neighbor child, Edith Carreau, to come join them and be homeschooled as a bonus sister to the Roosevelts. I mean, it's really Mitty who has this vivacious personality and strong empathy and emotion. And after his father dies, it's Mitty who says, we must live for the living, not for the dead. You would dishonor the memory of your father if you don't live a life of purpose. So you think about the two things we really know about Theodore Roosevelt, right? His incredible empathy, this outbound personality, and his ability to will himself through physical and emotional pain. Those are both from his mother.
Now, she also was a Southerner and a
was.
Confederate sympathizer. That was always part of the household. So tell us just a teeny bit about that. And also, you know, I'm a New Yorker, you're a New Yorker. New York has been graced by a lot of Southerners that have come to New York and then become New Yorkers. Did she do that?
She resisted it. She did all she could to resist it. So Mitty was actually born in Connecticut, but she was raised almost in her entire life in Georgia. They had Bullock Hall in Georgia, which is today preserved. Mitty was the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara. Margaret Mitchell later said that, so you can imagine what she was like. A devoted Southerner and devoted to the Confederate cause.
And a little bit of a flirt.
Absolutely, and a little bit of kind of impetuous. These love letters between Thee and Mitty are extraordinary. They're also captured for the first time in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and they're really quite fun. She refuses to wear her engagement ring, and finally when she puts on her engagement ring, she insists that her sister wear one as well to confuse gossip-prone society in Georgia. And then she writes a letter to Thee saying, he complains that he's been hearing she's been, you know, continuing to kiss other men. And she said, now how would I deprive the world of kisses from Mitty? She's a character.
I read that, and the business of a woman saying, I'm not giving up kisses from others.
No.
Too bad, big boy. You get used to it.
And Thee said to her in a letter, do not become a strong-minded woman. Well, too late. I mean, she already was. But she took these opinions on the Civil War to New York, and her mother and her sister came and moved in with the Roosevelts from Georgia. So Thee, his father, is basically away oftentimes in Washington, D.C. Theodore Roosevelt is being raised not only by all the housemaids and servants in the house, it's his mother, his aunt, and his grandmother who are raising him.
It's a good way for
a lot of women.
A young man to grow up.
Yes,
He's carried
exactly.
a lot of love. He's surrounded by love.
And also what I talk about in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is he grew up in a house divided in a nation divided. His parents disagreed on one of the most vehement issues of our nation's history, but they did so without being disagreeable.
Yeah.
And he learned from that example. He watched that example in his parents. Her brothers, by the way, just a quick note, so dastardly were their deeds for the Confederacy that they were among the very few who were not granted the general amnesty after the Civil War and lived the rest of their lives in Liverpool, England.
And just so we can lay the sort of case the joint, tell me where was this house?
So at 28 East 20th Street in New York City, which is now there is a replica, 100-year-old replica that is preserved by the National Park System.
Okay, and is that the house they were at when the Civil War alumni and Victory March took place and they looked out from the window?
Very close, very close. So if one of the letters, one of the 11 letters that is new to the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, one that was locked in that safe since 1954, is from December 31st, 1861. And it's Thee writing to his 3-year-old son, Theodore, and he has been in Washington, D.C. to meet with President Lincoln, and the stationery has a picture of Andrew Jackson and the statue in Lafayette Square, which sits in Lafayette Square to this day. And Thee says, I have just come from a meeting with the president who governs our whole country. And he has asked me to go around and talk to all the troops about sending money back to their families. And I have come across this statue outside the president's house. I want for you to read, I want your mother to read for you what is written on the statue so you can repeat it to me when I get home. And on the statue it says, "The federal union, it must be preserved."
Whoa.
So this is a
That's a great
3-year-old.
thing. That's
Right,
a
so,
great thing.
so there's this connection to the Civil War, and the question you're asking is, there's this famous photo of Theodore Roosevelt and his brother Elliot looking out the window at the funeral procession of Abraham Lincoln in New York City. That was actually at his grandfather's home, and the reason I mentioned the letter is he would actually, in that letter, Thee references, there's a statue that looks a good deal like the one near your grandpa's. So in Union Square in New York City,
on 14th.
there's a, that's exactly right, on 14th, there's a statue of George Washington.
Yes.
And so that is what Theodore Roosevelt would use to navigate from his home on 28 East 20th Street to his grandparents' home on 14th and Broadway.
Okay.
He would find the statue of George Washington, and he knew he was almost there.
Okay, so when did Theodore Roosevelt, the future president, meet his second wife first?
He met his second wife when she was Edith.
And the mother of 5 of his children.
Yes, when she was 3 years old. He only lived to age 60, so he knew Edith for 57 years of his life.
So
Pretty
he's 6
extraordinary.
and she's 3?
That's correct.
And tell us about that relationship.
Well, it's one of the most, I think, underrated and under-researched relationships between a president and first lady. I say in the book that Edith is the first modern first lady. She physically transforms the White House. She is one of his most trusted advisors, and it's largely because of this relationship that dates all the way back to childhood. We can talk about it in more detail, but Frank,
But isn't the story I always felt about it was that she loved him from the first.
Oh yes.
And he
Yes.
did too. He liked her, and he was sort of
Yes.
his tomboy friend and buddy and pal, and then he forsook her for the pretty girl.
Well, it's a mystery.
It's a
a
mystery.
historical mystery. So when Theodore Roosevelt is in college.
Well, wait, before he gets that, they were close. So they were
very close.
buddies. They were
very
pals.
close. So imagine this. In this little neighborhood.
15 and 12.
In this little, yes, she was the bonus sister.
It's a Neil Diamond song, you know?
Exactly. She's the bonus sister. So Edie,
And they called her Edie.
They call her Edie. Sorry, I slipped back and forth with the nicknames.
That's okay.
So when the Corot's fortunes were declining, the Roosevelts were steadily increasing.
So she came from a family that was going downward.
Exactly. Her father was an alcoholic. He took over the family business too early. He couldn't handle it. There are letter after letter of Edith talking about how she has to hide her shabby toys when the Roosevelts are coming over. She's so ashamed. She writes these longing, mournful poems entitled Joy and Sorrow or Out, Out, Brief Candle. I mean, she's a taciturn, quiet, introverted, highly intellectual. She's a writer and a poet, really kind of as inward focused as TR is outward bound in his personality. And I think
and pensive and thoughtful.
Pensive, and I think really was an intellectual match for him. He's a reader and he's deeply intellectually curious, and she can go toe-to-toe.
She saw something in him.
I think, but she also knew him to be impetuous and emotional, and I think she didn't like that side of him, that he was a little too rash. And so what happens if we fast forward now to August 22nd, 1878, Theodore's father dies in February of that year, and Edith has just turned 17, which means she is eligible to wed. And everyone believes that they are going to get engaged this summer. He spends her birthday with her. He goes out water lily picking. They go out and row on Oyster Bay. And then they walk up.
He's a freshman or sophomore at Harvard?
He's a sophomore at Harvard.
Okay.
And he's back home for the summer. And they go up this mountaintop known as Tranquility, which is ironically named because it was anything but tranquil when the Roosevelt family was there. And something happens. at that night. They have Edith and Theodore have a drop down, drag out fight. And they take the secret to their graves. They only speak of it each one more time in their lives. Theodore in a letter to his older sister Bammy, where he will say, I suppose we had and have tempers far from being the best. And Edith will say to one of her daughters that Theodore had not been nice. That's it. That's all we know. That's why we need the Netflix series of the Loves of TR, because we can speculate about what happened in that room. But they broke up, and that's it. And 2 months later, Theodore meets Alice Hathaway Lee, and it is Edith who. He is on, and Edith.
Is there any record of Edith lamenting the loss of Theodore during this period when he's with her, with Alice?
She puts up a brave face. She is very close with Theodore's sister Connie, and she does go visit him at Harvard. And there are some pinings in the way you might expect a college student to pine. He does go back and forth and say, oh, she's the loveliest woman I've ever known. But I mean, so clearly there's no record of how she felt. But she didn't give up. She didn't give up. She was there with him trying to change his mind.
Did she go to the wedding?
She did go to the wedding, and according to witnesses, danced the soles off of her shoes.
Wow.
She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing she was heartbroken.
So he's 21. Alice, we'll get to Alice Lee in a minute, but just to finish this, he's 21, 22 when he marries Alice.
22. He marries Alice on his 22nd birthday,
and Alice
October 27th.
Is younger.
Yes, she's 3 years younger.
So, and they're getting married, and then this 18-year-old old girlfriend's there too.
Correct. Yes,
man,
not awkward at all. And we have to remember, Theodore Roosevelt at this time is not the Theodore Roosevelt we know from history. He's not the Rooseveltian, from Mount Rushmore.
No,
he's a geeky naturalist in whose wake formaldehyde lingers.
And then now we'll talk about Alice right now. But I guess just on this, did Alice ever acknowledge Edith?
Oh, yes. They took a trip together with a large number of people for New Year's to Canada in 1882.
Whoa.
They were known. I write a little bit about this. Edith was always cold to Alice, and Alice was she understood why, but she tried to make friends with her.
Oh, cold. Edith was shy.
Edith was a little, I think, she was hurt. I mean, she was hurt, and she never got married. I mean, she on her wedding certificate to TR, she lists her occupation as spinster. So she self-acknowledges that she was never going to be.
Okay.
She was never going to marry unless she was going to marry Theodore Roosevelt.
Alice is a Bostonian.
She is.
And not a New Yorker. He's up at Harvard. He meets her. She's a Saltonstall. She's with that crowd.
And yes.
And they're different.
And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God.
The Yankee married a Red Sox.
That's right. That's
right.
So
was she as beautiful and spectacular as Teddy portrayed her?
Beguiling, a gamine. I think when I read the letters, I think of Audrey or Kate Hepburn. She is as outwardly expressive and ebullient as Edith.
Two different characters.
Totally.
Audrey and Kate are just very different people, but that's okay.
I feel like I can't decide which one, though, so I'm going to let the reader decide. I feel like, the beautiful like Audrey Hepburn, the personality of Kate Hepburn. How about that?
Okay, that's
You're kind of getting the best of both Hepburns. That's
really
something. That's what comes off the page.
When is her letters as literate and as eloquent as that would describe?
Yes.
Okay.
She is Theodore Roosevelt said, I talk over everything with Alice, from politics to poetry. In the letters that he writes her from Albany, he's previewing some of the ideas that will become the basis of his philosophy. In the Arena speech, The Strenuous Life, he's testing out ideas with Alice in the 1880s that he won't express for 20 more years.
How long were they married?
They were married only 4 years.
4 years. But during that time, he ran for state legislature and served in Albany.
Well, he rose like a rocket, in his own words, right? So if Alice was such a detriment to his existence, then how did he become the youngest assemblyman in the history of New York? How did he write his first book, The Naval War of 1812?
All happened in those
All
first
happened
years.
in the years he was married to Alice.
Wow.
Yes. And the only thing he ever quit was law school. He went to Columbia Law School, didn't finish. because he thought, and I write about it in the book, why would I want to be a lawyer when I could be a politician and make the laws?
So, and just on there, he's going up to Albany, serving in the state legislature, and there's a lot of history of the rise of Theodore Roosevelt right then.
Yes.
And I know a little bit about that, but Alice was in New York. She didn't come to Albany.
She did come to Albany once in a while, yes.
Oh,
they did have an apartment together in Albany. She did not prefer Albany to New York City.
Okay.
Again, back up, she's the most eligible Boston Brahmin bachelorette, period. I mean, she is a catch. And so the idea that Theodore Roosevelt, a geeky naturalist, New Yorker, might have some money, but still, he's his own classmates in college, eccentric, half crazy. They're not complimentary of the college-age TR. So he pursued her with a will. 2 years spent the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars buying her trinkets. He got a horse that he lamed. He rode the 12-mile round trip so often to Chestnut Hill. When he lamed the horse, he got a dog cart, which was the 1870s equivalent of a roadster. When he broke the roadster down, he walked to her home. I mean, I document in the book hundreds of visits.
Remarkable pictures of him looking at her.
Adoring.
He just fell for like a ton of bricks.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And 4 years married, and she becomes pregnant.
Yes, they had trouble getting pregnant. It was unusual to take that long to have your first child, and they finally get pregnant in 1883.
And how did she die? Why did she die?
She died essentially in childbirth. Technically, it was Bright's disease, which is a kidney disorder, but that was exacerbated by the childbirth. And whatever gynecological procedure she had in 1883 probably would have indicated that this problem could have been solved with modern medicine, but it's impossible to know. She did have an unknown procedure in 1883 to allow her to get pregnant. Could that have contributed? We don't know. But she essentially died in childbirth. And it's a pretty intense scene. We all know the end of the story, but
they died in the same house.
Theodore Roosevelt believed fatefully that his daughter would be born on the same day that they announced their engagement, February 14th, Valentine's Day. So he went back to Albany to participate in his committees. He got a telegram that his baby had been born on February 12th and that Alice was only fairly well. He continued his work and made plans to come home when he got a second telegram. We don't know the contents of that telegram, but we know TR's reaction. His face went ashen white. He ran from the New York State Assembly to the train station and took an agonizing 5.5-hour train trip back from Albany to New York.
Runs right along the Hudson.
And it would have normally taken 2.5 hours, but there was this thick, dense fog. The New York Times wrote a story, suicidal weather. You couldn't see but 1/4 of an inch in front of your face. Wow. So he had to walk from Grand Central to 6 West 57th, the new home of the Roosevelts. They had moved from 28 East 20th. And his brother is there and says, there is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too. He runs up to the 3rd floor. He holds Alice in his arms until 1:30 in the morning when he's called to the 2nd floor, where his mother, Mittie, dies of typhoid fever. And then he goes back up and holds Alice for another 11 hours until 2:30 in the afternoon, when she too dies of Bright's disease.
Oh. My God. Now, we've talked about, there's a lot written about his running out to the West and starting over. We're not going to cover that because that's not about the women.
You can come to the museum, July 4th, 2026. You can come hear that story.
And the baby Alice is born, and he basically turns his daughter over to his sister.
Yes. He abandons her, really.
I'm sure a lot of people in the audience know, and everyone who's listening or watching this knows, that Bammy was this remarkable woman that would have been president of the United States if she had been born a man, was smarter than them all.
According to Eleanor Roosevelt.
Did she have some physical deformity?
She did. She had a spinal defect, which is why her father formed the Forced Orthopedic Hospital in New York City.
And so she never married, I don't think.
She did marry. She did marry, but she wasn't until she was 42 years old, which was extraordinarily old for the age.
And she's older than Teddy.
Yes,
and sort of the older sister, and the responsible one. Right. And she sort of took charge. Is that right?
She understood the political chessboard. She knew to whom to introduce her brother. She knew the political moves he needed to make and when he needed to make them. She was responsible for making the introduction to the McKinley campaign. She's responsible for his becoming Assistant Secretary of State. She is the one who, at 1733 N Street, right around the corner from here, she had a home that was known by the press as the Little White House. He held his first cabinet meetings after the assassination of McKinley in Bamy's home.
She moved here.
She moved here ahead of him.
Yeah.
And she was overseas when she met her future husband. She was back channeling information from the UK, almost a diplomat of sorts, behind the scenes. And you said it, Robert. It was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter who said, if Bamy had been a man, she, not my father, would have been president of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt is later asked about that quote. It's her aunt, and she says, "Oh, I very much agree. That's no question."
And speaking of Eleanor, didn't Bamy introduce Franklin Roosevelt's father to Franklin Roosevelt's mother too? Isn't she responsible for that?
That is correct.
And by the way,
correct.
Sarah Delano is as fascinating as all of these women too.
Oh, yes.
I want you to know.
Oh, yes,
And
she is.
maybe that's the next book.
That could be the next book.
Yeah.
That's
But
good.
we'll
Yes.
come back to her. We
Yes.
won't mention her.
Well,
but
just quickly, can I mention at 1733 N Street,
yes.
right around the corner from here, Bamy loans the home to Eleanor and Franklin when he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Ah.
So they live in the same home that was known as the Little White House.
I didn't know that,
Isn't that
because I've
crazy?
gone over to look at that
Yeah.
house. There's a plaque on it, ladies and gentlemen. You should know this. It's also the site of, across the street there was a bombing of the Attorney General's house.
That's right.
And just a little sideline on this. That night, Eleanor and Franklin were at a party, and they were coming back, and they were 5 or 6 blocks away where they parked their car. And as they came toward the building where their children were, their little children, they heard this bomb,
Yeah.
and they realized there was a problem. And Franklin ran ahead and runs into his house, and there's glass all over the place and cops. And he runs up the steps, and he goes into the room, and there's a little 5-year-old and a little 6-year-old, and he looking at the window, and a little shocked and a little bit uncomfortable, he grabs them in their arms and hugs them. And then click, 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 Eleanor comes up the steps and looks in the room and says, "Why are you out of bed?" It's a little different character there. But anyway, getting back to Bamy. So I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So she's brilliant, and he always relied on her. And now, is she a good writer? Is the doc?
She's a remarkable writer. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, since we were talking about Eleanor, put it best. She said, if you wanted advice, you went to Bamy. If you wanted sympathy, you went to Connie. Right. The older sister was the one who had the political chessboard in mind. The younger sister was an empathetic, sympathetic outlet.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit about her, the younger sister.
Connie, I just love this family because Connie is, she's a poet. She's a writer. She's the first woman to introduce a major party nominee in 1920 at the Republican National Convention. She becomes a bit of a activist in her own right after the death of her brother. The best story I can think of, just to summarize Connie, when Theodore Roosevelt is governor of New York, they take advantage of the misogyny of the era by having these breakfasts with the bosses. And Boss Platt will come over and at some point say, "All right, everybody, now clear out. I want my time with the governor." And Theodore and Connie, very aware of what they're doing, will say, "Well, surely my sister can stay in the room. It wouldn't be anything consequence to have a woman." And he said, "Well, of course not. Sure, fine." She'll sit and she knits in the corner and listens to the entire conversation. As soon as the boss leaves, they discuss. She's heard everything. They discuss their political and personal options. So involved was she in his governorship that Theodore said, "Haven't we had fun being governor of New York?"
And he's talking about Connie, not
He's talking
Bamy.
about Connie.
Yeah, so-
He's talking about Connie.
And she was a little more sympathetic to him, and was she more fun than Bamy, or more?
I think Bamy, I think Connie was, yes, I think she's probably more fun. I think she was probably more fun. I think she just, by the way, Connie has the annual Christmas dance at which Eleanor and Franklin will dance for the first time.
Oh.
And where they each talk about really the first time they thought they might be interested in the other. So these women in TR's life they have multi-generational effects.
We talk about the social aspects. I'm going to get to Edith, how Edith made her recovery and re-emergence. But before I do that, was there a lot of drinking around the Roosevelts?
No. In fact, TR will later sue over the idea that he was a drunkard. It was a constant, the press and his political opponents constantly accused him of being an alcoholic. His brother Elliot was such a severe alcoholic that he actually died of alcoholism in the 1890s. That's Eleanor's father.
Franklin liked a cocktail.
Franklin liked a cocktail. Teddy did like a cocktail. He did drink.
Okay.
He wasn't a teetotaler, but he was very careful about it because of the death of his brother.
Well, Elliot was terrible.
And because of the political accusations, because of his behavior. He was so exuberant and such a big, strong personality. People said he has to be drunk.
Yeah. Well, so you're talking about that. Who is the source of the famous line about Teddy Roosevelt? Well, you have to understand the president's exactly 6 years old.
It was one of his cabinet members, yes, that made that observation.
And did the women reflect that position in their writing, that they make fun of Teddy Roosevelt's bully stuff, and they wouldn't have characterized it that way?
I think they each played a different role in trying to regulate that very strong personality and constantly revving motor. Edith is described as his emotional rudder and a better judge of character than Theodore. Okay. Theodore is a politician. He likes everybody. Yes. Edith is circumspect of everybody.
Okay, so
they each play a different role.
How quickly did she how soon after the death of Alice were they married?
They were married within 2.5 years of the death of Alice, and he was really guilt-ridden about it. He would actually pace the Ferris General Store in the Badlands of North Dakota, and Joe Ferris, the proprietor, he heard Theodore say, "I have no constancy, I have no constancy." He was, in the Victorian age, you were to live the rest of your life observing the death of your spouse. You were not to be remarried, and he was determined not to get remarried. He told Bammy and Connie, "When I come back to New York from the Badlands of North Dakota, there is one person I do not wish to see, and that is Edith." And somebody, we don't know who, again, set them up. Bammy was having tea with Edith. She went upstairs to freshen up before she was to leave. Theodore arrived, and Edith was coming down the stairs of Bammy's home. They saw each other again for the first time since Alice's funeral, and it was instant. Wow. They started dating almost immediately. They started to sneak around in carriage rides in Central Park. Within 6 weeks, they were secretly engaged. They told no one, including his sisters, because the news leaked in the New York Times about a year later, and Bammy demanded a retraction. She said, "This couldn't possibly be true. I would know if my brother were engaged to Edith Carow, and you must retract this." And the New York Times granted the retraction. So then she wrote her brother and said, "You won't believe what the damned New York Times has done." And he writes this very interesting letter back that begins, "The damned New York Times, always making up things about me, always lying. This one happens to be true." Wow. I am engaged to Edith, and we are to wed before the end of the year.
And and the sisters must have welcomed that. It was a good thing for their brother.
They each had different reactions, right? Because remember how I described how she was on the outside of the inner circle. She was the bonus sister. Her fortunes and the family's fortunes were descending as the Roosevelts were ascending. So Bammy and Connie always played central roles in their brothers' lives, so much so that others speculated that they never thought Bammy was ever going to get married because she was devoted her whole life to her brother. Yeah. And so Edith represented a bit of a threat to that. Edith was not like Alice. Alice would come home to 6 West 57th Street and yell up the stairs, "Teddy is home, come and share him." And Edith would say, "I think we've seen enough of Bammy and Connie for the summer season." She held him close. She wanted him all to herself.
But the pictures and the depiction of her and previous things, she was a formidable, strong, intelligent woman.
Incredible.
And a good first lady.
Well, let's just talk about her as First Lady for a moment. I mean, there's no precedent, really, for what Edith Roosevelt does in the White House. I mean, she physically transforms the White House. She hires McKim, Mead, and White to redesign the White House. That is the invention of the East Wing and the West Wing. They rename the home from the Executive Mansion to the White House. She installs a colonial garden, which will later become the Rose Garden. She begins to have salons and musicians and all kinds of public figures in the arts, which of course Jackie Kennedy will later emulate to great fame. She designs the separation between the residents of the White House because she has 6 children,
Yes.
3 of whom are home, and the executive function of the White House, and then installs the private offices upstairs. That's where TR's office is, and she put her office right next door. I write in the book, she's in the room where it happened because she designed it that way. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
And then she's, not only the first person to talk to her husband in the morning and the last person to talk to him at night, there are people observing how much she's such a better judge of character than TR. Universally, it's sort of seen that, if you get Edith to like you or you get her consent, that's the way you're going to succeed with TR, because he's too impetuous, he's too trusting, he's too open.
So did she immediately after they were married, take Alice into their household? The baby Alice.
The baby Alice. Well, so this is in that devastating letter where TR blames the New York Times for getting the story right.
Yes.
In this occasion. He says, I think you should keep the child. I think you should keep Alice. To Bammy.
Yes.
And that is the plan. His daughter. He's basically said, I think that it would be better if you raise, well, this was forever at this point, right? That I'm going to marry Edith and we're going to have a family, and I think it would be better if you kept Alice, which forms the basis of a very contentious relationship moving forward, which we could talk about. And then Edith steps back in the picture and says, no way. No, Alice needs to be part of the family. She's going to grow up with her. But it's a very contentious relationship. Edith keeps these meticulous ledgers of all the money that's going anywhere. I mean, Theodore was terrible with money. She would pin $20 to his suit at the beginning of the week, and by the end of it, he had no recollection of where it went. But she kept track of every dime, and in the entries, the ledgers for Alice, it just simply says Lee money. So her grandparents, very wealthy, the Saltonstalls, the Lees, they funded everything in Alice's life. Which, Edith was constantly pinching pennies. They talked about selling Sagamore Hill more than a dozen times in their life.
Alice was an heiress in her own right.
And Alice was an heiress in her own right, and it caused a lot of resentment with Edith.
And she's, the picture in your book, and we've known this, but Alice is 4 or 5 years older than any of the other children. So she's the big sister. Did she take on that role? Did she want to be everybody's big sister?
No.
Never. Not for a minute.
No, the kids very cruelly, particularly Ted Jr., reminded her at every occasion that she was not one of TR and Edith's children. And Ted Jr. later said that Mom said if your mom had lived, she would have bored Dad to death. And Alice, who famously lived at 2009 Massachusetts, just around the circle here at DuPont, where she had a pillow with an engraving, if you have nothing nice to say about anybody, come sit by me. She was known as Washington's second monument. I mean, just a fiery, interesting personality. Princess Alice, when she was in the White House, she's the one of whom Theodore Roosevelt famously said, I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. Yeah. And she gave as good as she got. She had a wit, and she's the one who said of Theodore Roosevelt, her father, he likes to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every baptism. So they were quite a pair, but it's all grounded in this really interesting relationship between, him denying her mother and the fractious relationship with Edith, and fascinating.
It's a remarkable set of characters, and I'm kind of done now. I've got all I wanted. That was really good. The book is wonderful.
Thank you.
What else? I mean, is there something else I should ask before we turn it over to the audience and see what they have?
Well, I think we've covered all the major characters. I mean, I don't get through a lecture without talking about Alice Roosevelt Longworth, because again, the other fascinating part of that dynamic is just the contrast with Eleanor.
Yes.
There have been some interesting books, studies written about, why does Alice is sort of this cynic who's very involved in Washington culture. She knows every president from her father to Gerald Ford. Famously, she's one of the last people to talk to Richard Nixon before he resigns. And in that long resignation speech that he gives, he cites Theodore Roosevelt several times. In fact, recites one of the letters that he wrote after the death of his wife Alice, and then goes into the In the Arena speech. So there's, in the audiobook of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, there's a conversation recorded between Nixon and Alice in which he's just won re-election, and he's saying something about how deeply he admires the example of Theodore Roosevelt. And she can't resist saying, well, how old are you now, Dick? She's calling the president Dick, right? How old are you, Dick? And he says, well, I'm 60 years old. And he says, what? Well, my father died at 60. You're far too old to be president. I mean, this is such a character, who would dare say these things.
Edith and Alice lived quite long time after Teddy Roosevelt died, and Edith was opposed to the last run for presidency, which wasn't Teddy Roosevelt at his best.
Absolutely.
And she also was notoriously press shy.
Yes.
She never liked to talk to the press.
Endorsed Herbert Hoover over FDR, caused a big rift in the family.
Edith did.
Edith endorsed Herbert Hoover, actually spoke at the convention in favor of him. Connie endorsed FDR and got lovely letters from Sarah and Eleanor, both saying you're the champion of the family. Thank you for doing this. So there's a whole other.
What did Alice do?
Alice was a strident Republican. She never.
And she didn't like Eleanor.
They had I think it's been overblown in history, but they had a very. I mean, I think she saw her as a goody two shoes, right? That Alice was a realist and Eleanor was an idealist, and they philosophically and politically did not mesh.
Okay. Well, okay, it's a great book, great, interesting women about a really spectacular story of American life. The lights are so bright here today, I can't see everybody, but let's open it up for questions, and I'll see if we've got any. I gotta see what I've got here. Looking over I like to favor the interns. Here's one, yes, right there.
I'm not an intern, but all of the interns of yours I know, I find them to be great Americans, just like the Roosevelt women.
Yes.
I'm really excited to read your book, but since you ended on Alice Roosevelt Longworth, I'm wondering if you would be willing to comment on a speculation that I haven't seen done yet. I'm wondering how you think the marriage could have been had Franklin decided not to marry his fifth cousin, Eleanor, who he was very different from, and instead decided to marry his fifth cousin, Alice, who he was far more similar to?
That's a great question. I've never thought about that. Well, I mean, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was a Spitfire, and I think that, there's very little evidence of much interaction or attraction with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Interestingly, FDR votes for TR in 1904, and then he tells the press, I did so because he was a better Democrat than the Democrat. Very clever. There's kind of this interesting interplay between the Hyde Park Roosevelts and the Oyster Bay Roosevelts throughout this period, and a connection between the fair deal and the square deal. And it's hard to speculate on what would have happened had they were not compatible, let's put it that way. I don't think FDR would have seen in Alice someone who would have made a good political partner, let's put it that way.
But I want to follow up on that. Before I do that, I do want to follow up on the comment made by one of their children. What do you think? Do you think that Teddy Roosevelt would have been as successful if Alice had lived and he had never married Edith?
I think he absolutely would have been as successful had Alice lived. I think you look at that 4 years that they were married, 6 years that they knew each other, and they're some of the most successful and productive of his political life. after she dies, and when Edith comes into the situation, he doesn't hold elected office for 15 years. He only lives till 60. That's a quarter of his
Well, elected
life.
office, but he was
He was
the commissioner of police in New York
Absolutely,
City, and of civil service, and
which
then
was
he was the
perfectly
assistant
fine by
secretary.
Edith, because those were positions where you had a steady salary, you weren't in the
Oh,
public
yeah.
limelight, you weren't the politician.
Yeah.
I mean, when he ends his presidency, Edith says, "I am so glad it is all over." I think she was done sharing him with the world, and she wanted to live the rest of her years together with him. You mentioned it briefly in passing, but it's worth returning to. Edith, objects to him running again in 1912. And she's the only one who levels with him and says, "Theodore, put it out of your mind. You will never be president of the United States again."
And she was right.
And she was right. She was right. She's the only one who could tell him that.
Yeah.
You know, I've talked a lot about, the influence of spouses, the influence of siblings. I mean, Joe Biden's recent decision. Who were the people he talked to? Jill Biden and Valerie Biden Owens, his wife and his sister. You know, these are the people that throughout time have the greatest influence. The ones that can go to the person and say the hard truth that an aide or a paid employee can't.
And with regard to Franklin definitely sort of was totally enamored and had kind of a crush on President Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
it's very possible that his affection for Eleanor was because it got him closer to that world.
I mean, I think that's definitely worth speculating on. I mean, I think that that is an under-researched subject, the connection between Theodore and Franklin, and the idea that these two, think about this. I mean, it's an American dynasty. I mean, one family is a part of nearly every single presidential election from 1900 through almost 1950. Right? It's extraordinary. I mean, either they're on the ballot, or they're in contention to be on the ballot, or they're in some way greatly influencing who is on the ballot, if not who wins. I mean, and that's quite, I can't think of another family. Adams, Bush.
Were Edith and President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, good parents?
Oh yes, oh yes. I mean, Edith devoted her life to the family. Edith, Margaret Chandler, one of her Washington socialite neighbors, says that Edith's entire world centers around the family. And I think it goes to your question about whether he would have succeeded with Alice. Alice was more comfortable in the limelight. Alice was more comfortable sharing him with others in the world. Edith, I think, could have taken or leave it. She knew that he needed a life of purpose, an example, but for her, the sun rose and set with family. And when the family was raised, she wrote this great chapter in this book with her son after TR died called "Cleared for Strange Ports." And the luggage tags on her suitcase are from everywhere. She outlives him by 30 years, and she will travel all over the world, and says that when the work of a mother is done, at the feet of the knitter lies the wide world. And she's got this great quote about, it reminds me a little bit of the Eleanor quote that you mentioned about her grandchildren. She says, "I love to see their little faces, but I prefer to see their backs."
Okay, do you have any other questions from our lovely audience? Yes, sir, right there in the middle.
Al Milliken. I was curious, how did the women in his life view his military career and his his love of hunting?
It's a great question.
That's a great question.
Great question. So quickly on the military career, each of the women played a critical role. Edith was pregnant with Quentin, their last son, and gave birth right before he went to the Spanish-American War in Cuba. And she was very sick afterward, nearly died, required an operation on an abscess at Johns Hopkins. And Theodore will later say, "I would have left the deathbed of my wife to serve in that war." Now, he knew, of course, that the outcome was positive, that she had lived. And there's a moment between them where she basically says, "Don't go." And then she recovers and she travels to San Antonio and then on to Tampa Bay with the Rough Riders. And that trip is really significant because it's her saying, you have to go. It's okay. If you don't make it, I don't want you to be on the field of battle thinking that I don't want you there. And so there's this kind of amazing 6 months in their life where he knows this is his one chance to live out the life, the glory that he's always imagined on the field of battle. And of course he does, but Edith is sick and might not want him to go. Very quickly, it is Bammy who introduces him to Richard Harding Davis, who's the journalist that makes him famous in Cuba. And it is Connie who takes the stories of his exploits in Cuba and slips them to the press. Each of them play a different role in their brothers' or their husband's success in Cuba. And the second part was hunting. I mean, they're all big outdoors people.
Yeah.
You know, the Roosevelt family growing up, they have these, you know, in the postcards and in the letterhead from the hotel, they will write, you know, 22 miles for Thee, 18 miles for Mitty, 7 miles for, you know, so they're all outdoors. They all love hunting. It's a part of their life. It's a part of their decor. If you go into any of the Roosevelts' home, you better like taxidermy because it's a primary feature.
But Sagamore Hill was Edith's play. I mean, Edith had a role there. If you go to Sagamore Hill,
Yeah.
you see Edith's influence, don't you?
What I love about Sagamore Hill, when you step back and think about it, it was originally called Lee Home, named for Alice. So it's a home that was...
He had it before.
But they never lived there.
Yes.
It was under construction when it began construction shortly after she died. So it was intended for one woman. It was constructed by another woman, Bammy. She oversaw the construction, and it was the home of a third woman, Edith.
Wow.
And each of them play a little bit of a role there.
And just tell us, Sagamore Hill exists.
It does.
It is a historic site,
Yes.
and you can go visit it.
You can.
It's not anywhere near a presidential museum or presidential library.
No.
But it's part of the network of Theodore Roosevelt sites.
It's a beautiful site. When Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919, Congress passed the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Association Act, the first and only time that Congress has memorialized a president who wasn't slain while in office. And they immediately formed a commission to decide where they should honor this president, who at 60 years old had died very suddenly. He was the leading contender for the 1920 Republican nomination, almost certainly would have been president again. And they set aside a park in Oyster Bay that is a memorial park to TR to this day, and they began plans for a memorial park in North Dakota that later became Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the only park in our system that is named for a person, let alone a president. So what I love to say is, you know, we're building Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library within a stone's throw of that park.
Yes.
When you're in the East, when you're at Sagamore Hill, you feel Theodore Roosevelt's ghost. When you're in the West, when you're in the Badlands, you feel Theodore Roosevelt's spirit. He had a northern father, a southern mother, an eastern birth, and a western political identity. He kicks open the door to the American century, and he is a uniquely American figure.
And with that, we will close out our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.